Alrighty, so welcome to the Blue Sky Ranger panel, Intellivision, a Legacy of Firsts. And just a little brief bit about me, and then I'll get to the guys here who definitely, most of them don't need an introduction for those of you sitting here. My name is Paul Nurminen. I am the producer and one of the hosts on the Intellivisionaries podcast, which of course we obviously talk a lot about Intellivision and the games and you know, these guys, the ones responsible for making those games, and a big part of my childhood, of course. You may have seen the little show yesterday about the Amico, the new console coming out. Some of these gentlemen are also involved in that, which we'll get to later. But briefly, just for those who may want a little rundown, like the Intellivision definitely had a lot of firsts in consoles. The development began in 1977 with General Instruments, APH, and Mattel, the Dave Chandler group at Mattel. APH was a technology company in Pasadena, and they did most of the original development. That was before these guys were doing stuff, before Mattel had their own team. It was released nationally in 1980. Actually went through 84 till a video game crash. And then it continued on as Intellivision Incorporated, then INTV Corp. And again, some of the people here were involved in those later games as well. But the console itself, I mean, a lot of us already know this, but it's a 16-bit, first one. You know, quite a bit before any other companies put out 16-bit consoles. First one with voice. You're out with baseball, actually. Right there. Yeah. And then, of course, later the IntelliVoice, which was a little more advanced and intelligible. Had the directional disc, precursor to the D-pad. You know, what do you see now? Mostly D-pads, right? You don't see the Atari joystick so much unless you're going retro like we are here at the Expo. They were the first to do the professional sports licenses. That was a big deal. That, you know, Major League Baseball, NFL football, NHL hockey sold a lot of the games because of those licenses. They had the onboard operating system, the exec, and that had a lot of routines that could be reused. Some of the sounds that were in there, and these guys will be able to tell you a little bit more about that. Of course, the keyboard component, which was only test marketed and kind of a failure ultimately, but well ahead of its time, and then later the ECS computer module, which gave it more voices, more sound, a little bit more memory, but not as advanced as the original keyboard component was. And there's quite a few other things too, but rather than me blabbing here, and like you can listen to the podcast if you want to hear that, let's get to some introductions. So let's start down at the end. I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves.
I am Stephen Roney. I started at Mattel in October of 1981. My released games that I worked on, Bill Fisher and I worked on Space Spartans, and then we helped John Soule finish B-17 Bomber. And the other game that I worked on that was released was a port of Utopia to the Aquarius computer. I also had spent a bunch of time working with Keith Robinson on Space Shuttle, which suffered from too much realism and not enough fun. And another game called Hypnotic Lights, which was just kind of trying to find something to build around an interesting effect. And then at the end of Mattel, I was almost finished with the ColecoVision version of Masters of the Universe, but, which showed at CES in 1984, but was never released.
I'm David Warhol. I worked at Mattel from 1982 to 1984 when we closed our doors. My first title was Mind Strike, which was slated for the ECS and released that way. I also developed Thunder Castle with Connie Goldman. And then as INTV Corporation ramped production up for the Intellivision after Mattel Electronics went out of business, I produced all of those games, the Super Pro line of all the sports games, pool billiards, all the re-releases and enhanced games. So about 20 titles altogether with a lot of the ex-Mattel crew, Steve Ettinger, Rick Koenig, John Tomlinson, and of course would have done design, a little bit of code contribution and sounds for those.
I'm Ray Kaestner. I joined Mattel Electronics in January of 1979. I started out working on the handheld games, so the handheld games I worked on were Computer Gen, which nobody saw, and Super Pro Football, which not a lot of people saw, and then, or it's World Championship Football. Yours was Super Pro Football. And then I joined the Intellivision group in, I think, 1982. And there I came up with Burger Time, was one of them. Thank you. I also did Masters of the Universe, which was also a fun game. And then after Mattel closed its doors, I worked with Dave on the IMTV games. So I worked on Super Pro Football, the hockey game, Slapshot Hockey, thank you, Mountain Madness, skiing, and Diner were my games for IMTV.
I'm Gabriel, also named Hal by an article in the TV Guide. From 81 to 84, I had the fortune to manage, misfortune depending on the day of the week, the group of programmers, music specialists, graphic design artists who formed the Blue Sky Rangers of Mattel. At the time I was working in London developing language teaching software for the Atari 400 and the Atari 800. I'm sorry, yeah, that's right. We wanted to extend our range, and we knew that the keyboard component was coming out any day now, and so we were determined to write some programs for them. So we got in contact with Mattel. I got to meet Josh Denham, and I remember going on a rant about what it takes to manage the creative process. He obviously liked the rant because 2 days later I got a call saying, "Would you like to interview for this job?" Mattel was anxious to create a competitor, an internal competitor to APH, and they wanted someone to build and lead the team. So that's how I got there.
Gabriel was my boss's boss, to give you a sense of that.
Yeah, mostly that's.
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah.
He was the great and the one and only Gabriel. My name is Bill Fisher. I started at Mattel in June of 1981. I interviewed when I was in college as my last quarter of UCLA, and got an offer from them. I believe, from what Daniel says, I was the first person offered a job at in the Hawthorne when you guys started hiring there, which was fun. And I did Space Hawk, Space Spartans, and B-17 Bomber. Space Spartans with Steve, and then B-17 with Steve and John Soule, the author of Astro Smash. And then after that, Gabriel decided that it would be a great idea for me to go to Taiwan and hire a staff to develop Apple II and IBM PC games, which was an absolute blast, by the way. So I went there and hired the team and trained the team for doing Apple II games and later IBM PC games. We had about 18 people at the end working on those titles in Taiwan, and he also hauled me out to Hong Kong. Darn, that was just a terrible thing to have to go to Hong Kong. It was awesome to vet some of the programmers for the initial team that was building games for the Aquarius. So I was involved in a lot of different games over the years, and some of my favorite ones were Burger Time for the Apple II and IBM PC, and we also were doing Lock and Chase and Night Stalker for Apple II and IBM PC. We had an entire wing of the booth in 1984 CES dedicated to those games, but only like two of the six actually saw the light of day, even though they were almost all finished by that time.
Very good. So I want to start just some questions early days, and I'm going to go to Ray because you were the first one there among the group here. You were doing handhelds, like you said, but you told me recently that you were there when the first Intellivision consoles started coming in, and I'm just curious what you thought of that, of the advanced video game, the competition against Atari. Just tell me your thoughts on what you remember from back then.
Yeah, so we were it was actually a converted factory area, so it was nothing like the offices that you would think of for a normal technology company. So it was had tile floors, and we had chicken wire, because when things like the Intellivision came in, when the handheld games came in, they were worried about people taking them home and not bringing them back, and so they put chicken wire around our office area to keep people out, to keep people from stealing the units that we got in. So shortly after, I hired on January of '79. Shortly after that, we got the first shipment of master components in, and So immediately we started opening the boxes and plugging them in. The first game that I saw played on the Masterphones was baseball, which was a great game, and we loved that game. But the thing that I mentioned the other day was the first time it got played, the first person that got out, we heard that, just people went nuts, you know. And the guy who was playing it, and he cranked the volume up full blast, and he went, you know, we must have heard it about 20 times, you know, because it was just so, and we're all dying when we hear this stuff. So, so that was early days. There was just a lot of excitement going on when things would come in as the keyboard component was being developed. I ended up doing parts runs to go out. You know, they would give me a shopping list. I would go to all the local electronics stores to buy parts so that they could breadboard the early keyboard components. So even though I was working on, and that's why I was connected with the Intellivision stuff.
Well, how did that go? Were the people in the handheld group, were they just like pulling people out of there? We need you to work on this new thing, or was it the instant hiring? And I know, Gabriel, you weren't quite there yet, but
there was two of us in the handheld.
There was only two.
When I started
Okay.
out, it was my boss and me.
All right.
So it was all hands on deck. We were doing everything that we needed to get the company going.
So then let's go to Gabriel here. When you came in, you mentioned a little bit about that, but did you choose Mattel for the reason of the Intellivision and what was going on with that group, or you know, how did that come about?
Well, there was nothing much going on with the group. There was no...
There wasn't any. You came in to make the group.
Right. I was beyond excited. I mean, that's the way it was. I had been, as I said earlier, I'd been developing language teaching software, cassette-based, a lot of limitations that you can all imagine, and suddenly to have the opportunity to build a team, to build software. And when I say to build a team, don't think that I arrived there thinking that I was going to program. I mean, I've not mentioned this before, but I did actually think that, you know, there are 4 people there plus me, or was it 3 people there plus me, and I did some programming. I always enjoyed programming. I always thought programming was an end in itself. It did something to the brain that was useful. So I thought I would program. I was disillusioned very quickly. And I was very, very excited because there was a whole base of consoles there that we could build for. There were no development systems, or minimal number of development systems, so I knew there would be a technical task to build that. I remember going back to England after interviewing here, and I said to my wife, are we really going to do this? But yeah, we were really going to do this. That was exciting.
Can you speak a little bit about how you recruited the talent and the hiring practices there? Because it was a pretty diverse group.
Yes, I had started my career teaching assembly language programming. And you ask yourself, how do you start a career teaching assembly language programming? And the answer is, you just stay 2 lessons ahead of your students. But I noticed that my fellow teachers, my students, and then I later went on to do some programming, or to do quite a lot of programming. But in those days, we're talking about the late 60s. And if you think that there were any computer degree courses, or that anyone was coming out of college knowing how to program, you're wrong. There was nothing there. And I noticed, and it stuck in my mind, and I've lived with it ever since, that the best programmers that I met were historians, musicians. The very top programmer I knew, still a friend of mine, studied Greek and Latin at Oxford. And they lent themselves to good programming. And I've stuck with the idea that if you're a musician, you're a made programmer. It just seems you have to have a good control of the arts to be able to deal with the science. So when I came to Mattel, I just kept that mindset. I don't think I had another mindset. So while we looked for people with programming skills, when I interviewed, which I always did initially towards the end, I was always looking for other interests. Are you a musician? I don't mean, do you like music? I mean, you know, are you a musician? Do you have any passion at that's not computers. And I got some really good stories. I mean, obviously the guy who dressed up every year to go to the, I don't know what you call them when you're dressed as a jousting Renaissance fair. Yeah. I mean, that's not what I expected. We employed him. And someone has documented the fact that he felt that he was failing the interview with me because I kept saying, but why do you really want to come here? And he got so exasperated that he said, well, I guess I'm weird, I suppose. You're in. I've always carried weird as a badge of pride. Yes. But that was the style. That's what we were doing. Looking for people who had skills both on the art side and the science side. And that's how we built the teams.
I had 3 interviews with Mattel. One was the HR, the second was technical, and the third was with Gabriel. The first 5 minutes were my qualification, the next 5 minutes were what's it like to work here, and then the next half hour was about the symphony in Northern Europe from 1920 to 1950. He was like, I just can't figure it out. And that got us into a conversation which obviously led to, oh, okay, with this guy.
So when you started hiring and you guys started coming in, what was the early development like? And was it a challenge to bring all these different people in to work on this relatively new technology?
Let me I'll start, but the real answers come from my right to my left. There was very limited development systems. The main development system was out at APH, the company that was doing most of the work for us. We had a limited one that we could work with, that we were trying to build further. So it was a rough environment to work in. What would you say, Baum?
Yeah, definitely. And since I was doing one of the very earliest games, I mean, what we had was a time-sharing computer. It was running RT10 that everybody had to run off of and compile their games on. And you had, a CRT terminal. And back in those days, oh boy, we had a CRT. We didn't have to use punch cards, which that was fairly new stuff. But we developed the game, and there was this one shared unit. It was this APH box. It was about this big with a blue and white thing with dip switches or toggle switches all along the front. And it was jacked into an Intellivision unit because it was an in-circuit emulator, if you know what that is. So it was basically replacing the CPU with this thing that would allow you to trace through and find out what was going on. The problem is that we had, I don't know how many people were back there in what we called the submarine. There weren't a lot of people. There was like half a dozen of us, I think, back there, something like that. And me, and I know Min Chow was next to me, and I think Rick Sinatra was in another cube, and so forth. But we had to share this box. And so you sit there at your terminal figuring out what you want to write, and you write all the code, and you compile it, and then say, okay, it's my turn, nobody else is using it, great, I'm going to run over there and download the stuff in there, and it'll take a second to download it. And then you run the game, and you sit there and play it, and watch what happens. You could set primitive breakpoints, and you could do a few other things. But there was a lot of guesswork involved. I mean, it was like, we had one thing to debug on, and you were just spending a lot of your time, just like you did back in the old days of the punch cards, sitting back at your desk and saying, okay, this is what happened. Oh my God, how did that happen? That's just not right at all. So it was very challenging. It was very difficult, and you had to share those very limited resources in order to get anything done.
There were no really debugging stations, so I would compile a program with a crash statement in it, and then I would play the game, and if it crashed, it would be like, yes, I figured out what it was. And so a lot of it was just thinking the game through in your head and figuring out what the problems were, because we were the fastest debuggers there.
I'll speak to the environment, because the environment means two things. One is the technical side of things, but there's also just sort of the social side of things. And we were talking about that a little bit earlier this morning. And you hire all these creative people with all these divergent interests and divergent personalities. And so there's people that are kind of total wacky people, and then there's people who are a little more serious, and everywhere in between. And that made it a really fun place to work. You'd have people like Keith Robinson, who's just got a planet-sized personality and projecting that everywhere. The guy in the cube next to me for a while, he had this mechanical bird that every so often he would just throw this mechanical bird, and you'd hear him cackle when he did it. And there's just all kinds of interesting, crazy things going on, and somehow or other, getting everybody to work together, to pull together, to develop these games that made it a fun environment to work in, and a fun place to be. And I was joking with Gabriel. I go, well, somebody had to mind the children, and that was him.
Well, since APH was doing the early games, was there kind of a competition when you guys started going, like, to outdo them? Because I know they had you know, contracts with Mattel to supply games, and then you're sort of a competition to them once the group got going. So
yeah.
Was it a friendly competition, or was it?
No.
No.
Not in, I mean, I wait to be contradicted. So there were two kinds of, there was friction just because of the business. Why would APH want Mattel to build a big internal team to develop games? Why would they? And I totally understand that. So there was that. There was certainly the creative competition, which you mentioned, that, you know, who can build better games. But that's delightful. I mean, that's good. The other thing is they controlled the development systems. They had development systems. We had very limited ones. And they were not anxious to hand over the details of the more advanced development systems. Again, I understand them perfectly. But nevertheless, it made life extremely difficult, and we all smiled at each other. You know, but it was, the fangs were there.
Well, and the good news is I never felt the fang side of it. You know, for me it was, okay, this is what you're given. These are tools, you got, go with it. And you know, for me, the number one thing was, let's make great games using the system. Let's leverage it to the maximum possible ability of what the hardware is capable of doing. And so that turned out to be the focus. I don't know, I had made perhaps a naive but very, very forward-looking approach to this. And it was just like, okay, how can I get the most out of this box? How can I do new things? How can I do stuff that nobody's done before? And that was really where the focus came from. So fortunately, the tools did not impede too much. The hardest part was when you found a really nasty bug, and I was just going to say, you know, environmentally, one of the great things is that people were always helping each other. When I had my really nasty crash bug in Space Hawk, I finally turned to Mike Minkoff, and Mike sat down with me and said, I think I know what's going on here, and he showed it, and he was the actual one who found the interrupt that was happening inside of an interrupt, which I just could not figure out. And he, you know, helped me in a couple hours and solved my problem, and then that was the big bug, and it was great. It was really great.
And I mentioned the sports licensing early on, but Gabriel, I know it was more marketing thing, but can you speak a little bit about Mattel's push to get licensing for games? Very, you know, Data East, you know, the Tron stuff.
I know, quite honestly, very little about that. I did accompany marketing several times. I had some very enjoyable sessions with Data East. My only direct involvement with licenses was Tron, where for one reason or another, I went to England and I was on the set of Tron. But my role in that particular case was to try and find a storyline for a game. And while I take all the credit for everything I can take credit for, I do know one thing: I'm not a creative guy. I'm not the one who's going to find the storyline. I'm not the one who's going to find the graphics. Nevertheless, for one reason or another, I was there, standing on the set, talking to people who were as bemused as I was at the idea of trying to find a video game story out of this particular movie. And I came back, I gave my report, I said what it is that we could do. Nothing to do with my ideas, but one of the most successful games that Mattel made came out of Tron. But that's my only experience of licensing, direct experience of licensing.
Okay. But since we talked about the adversarial relationship with APH, did that also exist with the marketing team? As far as not necessarily licensing, but perhaps dumb ideas, things that were like, no, we can't do that, that's ridiculous?
When I was applying for jobs in subsequent years, I used to talk very confidently about the natural tension that exists between marketing and development. That was a polite way of putting it. Yeah, there was, not adversarial, but there was tension. They had different aims. Again, I totally understand all these things, but my aim was to keep a protected environment where the developers could develop and do exactly what was needed to produce superb games. Marketing wanted all of that. Well, maybe not the protection, but maybe they wanted all of that, but they wanted dates, they wanted times, they wanted specific gameplay. There were lists of things that the characters could or could not do, depending on the license, which you mentioned to me. So, different relationship, stressful,
Sure.
but in the end productive.
We did do the Kool-Aid Man game, if you guys are familiar with that. And I did see it listed as the worst game of the year in one review. And it was brought to us to do that. We had a game competition of who wanted to design it. Maybe 5 or 6 things were, ideas were floated. One of them was selected. We ran the game through. But I would say that was a marketing-driven game, which demonstrated that starting with a marketing idea didn't necessarily make for the best gameplay.
And, you know, everybody was kind of doing their own game, like a solo project in those days. But I just like to hear a little bit about how you sort of, I guess, ultimately people develop specialties. Somebody was known for debugging, somebody was known for graphics, someone was known for sound. Did that just sort of evolve naturally, or Gabriel, did you have any part in, you know, hey, you should do this, you should do that?
I think my colleagues can answer that better than I can.
Sure.
Well, Steve, you and me, right?
Well-
we became the Rescue Rangers.
Yeah, for those 2 games, and that was the rare game that had multiple programmers working on it, on the gameplay itself. There were other, you know, Dave became involved in doing sound for games that he wasn't otherwise working on, right? And then I guess Ray, you had also ended up working on another game with a team.
I did probably one of the few team games as well. Masters of the Universe I did jointly with Rick Koenig, and that was actually pretty straightforward because we divided the game right down the middle, and Rick's half was the Wing Raider part, my half was E-Man was there kind of running around through the fireballs and stuff. And so it was the delineation of what we were doing was really clear as to what Rick was doing, what I was doing. And then I got to do a lot of the transitionary screens between the 2 halves of the game, just because I had a little bit of extra time.
And
I
would say Connie Goldman was hired originally as a programmer, but very gifted artist, and then she ended up supporting everybody, and there were a few dedicated artists in the group. So yeah, people did gravitate into their own specialties.
Yeah, Bill Goodrich did the sound for Burger Time and did a brilliant job on the music too. So it's like I got to give credit to, you know, Connie and Karen Nugent did the graphics on Burger Time and stuff. So they were all a big part of the success that we had.
Yeah, it definitely evolved, and you know, like with Space Spartans, it was a little bit harder because Steve and I had a game that was tossed to us at about 50% level of completion because the programmer had left Mattel to ultimately go form iMagic, and then handed it off to our boss, and our boss was too busy to deal with it, and he handed it off to us and said, "We need to get this thing done." You know, and so we had a bit of a harder thing because like he would do the targeting computer and I would do the AI for the combat mode and stuff like that. So we were actually splitting it, and then we had to get our code to meet in the middle.
Yeah, basically, I was the ship that the player controlled, and he was the enemy. So it really did kind of work out. But we had all the voice was already recorded, so we couldn't like. Those were the things we got to say. We would only say the things that were previously recorded, and we had to make those things work. So, you know, all the names of the systems were already defined, and we had to figure out what they did, because they didn't.
Yeah, what is the difference between the battle computer and the targeting computer? You know, but we figured it out. I mean, we literally sat there and said, okay, we got this battle computer thing, we got this targeting thing. How's that going to work? Why are they different? Why are they worth it? Yeah, we literally started from, I have no idea. And we came up with stuff, and it worked. You know, it was a lot of fun to do that, actually. It was a puzzle to solve. It's not like it was a dreadful thing. It was a lot of fun, actually.
Well, I'm also curious to know about graphics and gameplay, kind of the balance there, because the Intellivision was always, you know, showing up Atari in the commercials. We've got better graphics, more colors, better sounds. How did you, was it like we have to go for the best graphics we can and whatever's left over we make gameplay, or, you know, it's got to be some friendly mix there, so.
Let me just start the answer, and I'm not the best person to answer it, but it was you know, you had beautiful graphics, so you had wonderful gameplay, but the technique of finding both was difficult. Because the only thing I'm reminded of is a game that never saw the light of day called Fishing. Rick, who did the medical one for Magic.
Oh, Rick Levine?
Microsurgeon.
Yeah.
Rick Levine.
Yeah.
Rick Levine programmed that, and I remember going to see it with, maybe Mike Minkoff came with me, and it was beautiful. I mean, it was leisurely. You looked at it, and the water flowed, and the mountains were there. It was absolutely delightfully beautiful. But there was no gameplay. I mean, what do you do? You know, there was a guy with a rod, obviously. We couldn't work out what the gameplay would be. It never saw the light of day. And that's just one example of a problem that these guys just faced day to day on every game.
These cartridges are so limited in memory, 4K, 8K, maybe 16 at the in the INTV days, that graphics and game programming for me were the same thing. It's how can I represent this image but crunch it down into the smallest number of bytes? Or I've got an AI routine, but how can I make it happen in the smaller? So a lot of the maximizing the graphics and the gameplay was minimizing the space that it took in the cartridge.
I mean, it was definitely putting it in the trash compactor and squeezing and squeezing and squeezing and watch what, you figure out what could come out. I remember sitting there with my wife one day trying to figure out how to reduce the number of unique gram cards we used for the map of Europe in B-17 Bomber, because we had to squeeze every last decal out of that thing. I mean, keep in mind that the code in that game is only 7K worth of code. 5K of that 12K cartridge is graphic, or is voice data. And so we sat there and figured out, oh, well, if we make the boot of Italy a little bit distorted, we can use this character out of the character set to, you know, put that side blue and that side green. We can stick it there and it's going to be close enough. And we actually went through and optimized out a number of the characters just by cleverly maneuvering around the sizes and shapes and colors of the bits of Europe. So, you know, there's a reason why it looks a little distorted. We were able to save, you know, 20 or 30 decals by being clever about which pieces we used. And that was the kind of stuff you did in every single one of our games. And Steve, you can talk maybe about the contest that we did, because Steve was one of the champions in the do the same thing in less code contest that we used to have.
Yeah, every once in a while someone have I mean, we've told this a lot, but maybe you guys haven't necessarily heard it, because we haven't said it in Portland. We'd have someone have a bunch of code, maybe it might be like 20 bytes long, and somebody would look at it and say, well, I could do that in, I'm saying bytes, but it was really, we call it decals, because they were 10 bits wide. So, but someone would say, well, I can do that in 18, or I can do that in 17, or, and I guess I was pretty good at that. So there was one instruction in your friend the assembler manual, which it said, you won't need this, it's just included for completeness, and I took that as a personal challenge. And I managed to use it. It was something that had to do with, I think it was explode status word, where you take the bits that are in the word and you put them, one would go into sign, and one would go into carry, and one would go into overflow. And then if your bits in the word were in the right place, you could do that, and then you could do a branch on carry or branch on, you know, so you could test the bits in a row without having to have masked them. You know, the other ways to test them would be a lot more code than just that one instruction.
I was going to say, for Burger Time, the way that I set up the game was that I initially did the gameplay, and then once all the gameplay was done, I figured whatever space happens to be left over, that's what I'll put different screens on for Burger Time. So it turned out that when all was said and done, there was enough room for 7 screens. So I thought, that's why Burger Time has 7 screens. Burger Time was an 8K game. Diner was a 16K game, and a lot of the reason that the special effects on Diner were so good was because I just had all that extra memory that I could do stuff that I couldn't do in a smaller game.
We got down to the point in Space Spartans where we had to squeeze around the B-17 Bomber, we had to squeeze every last decal at the last minute. And if anybody wants the full nerdy story, you can come to the booth afterwards and they'll tell you the full nerdy story of how you can use the decrement program counter instruction in a game.
Well, Gabriel, was it your job to kind of rein these guys in if they maybe went off a little too wild, because you mentioned the failure of the fishing idea from Rick? Well, at what point did you say, you know, this is just not going to be a game? you got to rethink this.
When you said rein in, I thought you meant rein in the exuberant spirit.
No, you don't want to do that.
I didn't do much of that, at least I tried, and I failed. Here we are. But if you mean ending a game, it was hard.
Yeah,
it was hard.
Yeah.
But it did happen. Fishing is the one I remember. The one these guys probably don't know about, but really did exist for a while. Crossword. You did know it. Yeah.
Well, I actually worked on the I worked on the crossword game for the keyboard component. That was my very first task.
Well, there was an earlier one that was attempted, and in any case, saying no, saying, you know, we can sit here smiling, but it's not all fun. There really is, as you all know, a discipline about programming. Here we're talking a lot about the creative side because it's what you need, and it was a first, I think, in terms of building and managing a creative team. But now you understand that, but the discipline of programming is a different story. And so there was a serious, a serious component of the management and all these people's work. And yes, there were times where we had to say, not enough gameplay, not enough interest, it's got to end.
Except when Vectron came out, you didn't say that. but I'm actually the one person, maybe out of three people. Oh yeah, Steve in the audience there. We actually like Vectron, but
I'm so relieved because there was an offsite, and Josh Denham, the president, came up to me, and he had a Vectron in his hand, and he just looked at me, showed me that, he said, "This must never happen again." That story has not been told before.
That's awesome.
Vectron was a Tempest emulator. I know a lot of our games like Buzz Bomber was Centipede, but was Tempest.
It may have ended up being one, but it's my fault because I was obsessed, being simple-minded with, I was obsessed with Pong, the simplicity of it, the classic nature of it, the way it followed all the laws of motion, of physics. I just loved it. So I went to, I had one attempt to influence game story development. I went to Mark and said, Mark, what I want is a game that's totally abstract, but that has the same hypnotic nature as Pong. Well, that would have been a good thing to say if I had gone back and built on it. But no, I never spoke to him about it again. And he did. I think he did an excellent job, and it didn't end up the way I would have liked, and certainly was not a great seller. But that was an example of a game maybe you should have stopped.
I liked it too. And one thing I've never told before is how you quashed my idea for extending Spacehawk. I had an idea for a little screen where you'd adjust your shields and your power and the other things, and that was going to be an add-on to the game, and I thought it was going to be really cool. And you said, no, you can't do it, we got to ship the game.
Oh, that's right, but that would have to do with shipping times.
That did, yeah, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying, that was another. That was a perfect example, though, of when you have to say, no, enough's enough. That's fine, it's good enough, get it out the door.
You're reprimanded now, all these years later. Well, that speaks to, because you guys are trying to do new and innovative stuff. You're trying to outdo Atari, you're trying to do games that have never been done before. And there's a risk there, obviously, because you're going to come up with some crazy ideas. So, how did you go about tuning a game? I know, like with you, Ray, you got Burger Time done relatively quickly because you had to go get married, right? So,
right.
But just maybe speak a little bit about tuning games.
Right. So the schedule for Burger Time, it was open. There was no dates that were required of me. So I was given the game early September. I had just come back from vacation. Given the game in early September. Now I was going to get married December 18th, and so I had set myself a deadline of I'm going to be done well before December 18th because I just don't want to have to worry about the game while I'm on my honeymoon. And so I had set that date, and at the time, Gabriel can probably say, when I said that date, well, I'm sure Gabriel was saying, oh yeah, that's good. And secretly in his mind, he was probably saying, nobody has ever done a game in 3 months before. And so I set off to do it, and instead of doing 3 months, I did it in 2 months. And then, since I finished it a month early from my own personal cutoff, I had a month to play it and to get other people to play it, and to watch people playing it, and to play it myself, and tune it, and decide how, you know, how fast should the bad guys be moving? How fast should I do speed ups on them? So for the advanced levels, and all those sorts of things that made it a lot more fun, a lot more special, and also a lot more like the arcade game. So, just putting time into at the end of the release to do tuning. Most people didn't have that luxury. It was really a schedule thing. But whenever I scheduled a game, I would schedule that in from the get-go.
My observation is that there were so few graphics to connect that there was plenty of time. The preponderance of time was making it fun. When I was developing Mindstrike, the game itself was done in 3 months, but we were playing it from the first week or second week, just smaller portions of it. So we tuned it as we went along. And then in Mindstrike's case, I needed a computer AI, which took another 3 months, and that gave us another 3 months just to build more boards and things like that. But it's directly inverse of how many graphics can you put in there. Our time was spent in making it fun, and that's one of the things I want to say is one of the things about the new intelligent console is that the idea is that it's about bringing the fun into the game relative to the size of the graphics more than it being it's fun because it has a ton of graphics in it. It's because we didn't have all that graphics that we concentrated on the actual spirit of the game.
Yeah, which is what made those games so great, and what's what we're trying to do with the new Intellivision Amico. Can you talk, and this is open to anybody on the panel, just briefly how development changed over time? Because obviously the original games were running, they had kind of a reputation maybe for being slow, the slow running man, because it was running at 20 hertz. And then that was using the exec, but then you guys developed ways to run it at 60 hertz and speed things up. And then Mattel had their little trademarked super graphics, which was, ported. I think He-Man was the game that said that on the box. But yeah, just speak a little bit about how that changed as you got more comfortable.
Yeah, He-Man was the first one. It was a marketing thing purely. Yeah. The way it was marketed made it sound like there was new hardware involved, that it was something special and different. Basically, it's just a different way of programming. And at that time, Mattel was so anxious to drum up more business that after they had come up with the Super Graphics logo for He-Man, they said, "Oh yeah, Burger Time's got pretty good graphics too. That's Super Graphics too." And basically, a lot of the work that had been done by Imagic and Activision in going to the Intellivision, they worked around the exec, which was kind of the slow basis for so many of our games. And after we saw Imagic and Activision doing faster games, we had to do it too, because it wasn't right for them to be doing games that looked better than our games. And so we jumped on that pretty quick. A lot of the work that was, Rick Koenig did a lot of the work for Masters. The Wind Raider screen looked really sharp and really quick. I had been doing a lot of work on Intellivision 3, which would be the follow-up to Intellivision 2, which also incorporated a lot of those sorts of things so that you could move faster than the 30 or the 20 hertz of a normal game. My part of He-Man was moving at 30 hertz, which was like night and day compared to the 20 hertz game. So we kept moving in that direction.
And then just this is for you, Dave. You certainly did an impressive thing with Thunder Castle and putting the wall-to-wall music. Can you speak a little bit about that? And also, although it was kind of a failed attempt in a way, the ECS, how it added the additional 3 voices and just stuff you did with the sound and music.
The Intellivision had 3 channels of sound in it, but the way to turn on and off a channel of sound took a prohibitive amount of space. Computer instructions, I mean, it's just a lot of space, so not a lot of the games had that in there. But from my background in music, I figured out a way to minimize the amount of memory required to represent a note on or a note off, and created my own audio driver separate from the exec that allowed me to put in, I don't know, 10 times more music than had ever been in a game before while it still had the game. Now with the ECS, it gave us 6 channels, but there weren't a lot of other games that used it other than the music keyboard that used the extra 6 channels in that.
Yeah, but it had the potential to do quite a bit. So, I mean, had the video game crash not happened, while the ECS was underpowered, but there were like RAM expansions planned for it, and it could have gone a long way. But it looks like we're getting a little close on time here, I think. So just final thing, what are you guys doing now? You want to talk a little bit about that? I know what you're doing, Steve.
Yeah, I was supposed to be retired, but when Keith died, I took over Intellivision Productions, and now I'm also involved in television entertainment. So busy still going through the stuff in television productions and unloading the things that we don't need, letting other people who want them more have a shot at them. So
sure. Yeah, we'll just go down the road here.
Real-Time Associates, which I formed after Mattel, released about 100 cartridges thanks to the fact I got an early start. Right now, I've taken that experience and I'm doing 2 projects. One is a holographic telepresence where we digitize a human being in 3D, transmit them over the internet, and then recreate them as a hologram, kind of like Help Me Obi-Wan Kenobi, You're My Only Hope. And the second project I'm developing is a 360-degree 3D interactive theater, which is more like the holodeck from Star Trek. And we have both of those things working in Long Beach. So I'm developing technology from both the Star Wars and the Star Trek universe.
After I stopped working in television, I went to the wonderful world of aerospace, and so I was working in that for a few years until I couldn't take it anymore. And then I started doing PC software, and I've been working at Oracle most recently.
And I spent my career managing software development. I enjoy the development process. But when I stopped that about 10 years ago, I returned to my initial love, as it were, which is languages. So I started dealing with translation and translation programs and interpreting, and I spent some time teaching technology for translators at Chicago University. There's a lot of technology available to aid the translation process, and I don't mean by that automatic translation. So I was teaching there. I think I'm retired now.
Just yesterday morning I went to the gym and we had a nice class where they asked everybody in the class, well, what is your dream job and what are you actually doing right now? And so we went around and people said, I want to be a coffee roaster, or I want to be a coffee taster, or I want to run a food truck or whatever. And they got to me and I said, well, you know, my dream job would be like design a new video game console. I was like, wait a minute, that's what I'm doing. So in addition to everything else, which I could go on at length and don't want to here because it would take too much time, I've got all sorts of games and restaurants and things like that I've got my fingers in and that are a lot of fun. But obviously, getting to design a new video game console is a once-in-a-lifetime thing, and I'm delighted to be able to play a part in that.
Yeah, as am I. Okay, so that's going to do it. I guess you guys are going to have a signing around the corner here. I think, I'm not sure the number here, but I think it's
if you
table name.
Yeah, if you exit and go all the way around the circle, you'll be able to find where the F rooms are, and that's where we'll have you guys.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks for coming to the panel. Obviously, the previous panels were moderated by Keith Robinson, who we lost last year, and I'm kind of humbled and honored to be able to do this this panel with these guys, because they made a lot of happy memories of my childhood, and I continue to celebrate the stuff that they did, so let's give them a round.